Something that I hear a lot that's always really bothered me is that video games being linear automatically makes them worse. Now, not only do I think a video game being linear is not a bad thing, I think it's actually a good thing. And it's a matter of choice, but I think it does have a lot of positives going for it in its favor. And when it comes to retro video games, it makes sense that I would feel this way because quite a few retro video games are in fact linear, especially if you're looking at 8-bit and 16-bit games. So first I want to address this idea that linear is just inherently a bad thing. I think this comes from the idea that if a game is non-linear, you're given more choices, therefore it's more content, it's a bigger game. These are all things people just stereotype as being really good. Whereas if a game is linear, it feels like choices are being taken away from you, you're on this set path, it's inherently limited. Well, the thing is, by being linear and being more, limited, as people like to say, it actually gives the developers more control over the game to design the experience to be what it should be, what their vision of it is. If there's all these different choices, then there's more variables and they lose control over what the gameplay experience is going to be and what the game is going to offer you. Now, again, I'm not saying that choices are bad, but the more choices you're giving the player, the more work the developer then has to do. And if it's a whole bunch of different choices and different possibilities they have to cover for and account for, they could end up spreading themselves thin and the quality could really suffer as a result. Now, if the choices are more limited, which is very inherent to a linear game, then they can just really focus on what's there. Okay, they know the player is only going to experience these levels in this order, and they can just hammer it home, really focus down on what that gameplay is going to feel like and what that game experience is going to be. Now, in theory, you can have a lot of choices and still just put in enough work to make sure any choice you make is still going to result in a fun game experience, but a lot of times when you have that many different choices to account for, a lot of that content that is created as a result of all those choices just becomes kind of filler and not very good. Of course, there's a lot of modern games that are good examples of this, where they offer you a million different choices, this giant open world, but a lot of what you're doing in that is just boring, stupid, repetitive, not very fun. Now, of course, there are still a lot of retro games that offer lots of choices, open-ended gameplay, all that kind of stuff, but the thing is, with retro games, they're often still much smaller in scope compared to more modern games, that they can still pull it off. A good example of this would be Chrono Trigger. Now, Chrono Trigger is very well known for having its multiple endings, a whole bunch of different endings, and it still pulls this off because even though it might seem like a lot of different choices and you can go through the game a bunch of times, the endings are different enough that it's cool enough to see all of them, and the game is still small enough in scope that the developers were able to put in the effort to make sure every single one of those endings is a quality ending, and all the different choices that you make in the game are going to result in really good gameplay. So what you end up having is essentially this balancing act of having all this different content, but also needing to make sure that it's all good. Whereas with linear games, you have to worry about a lot less. It's just this fixed path, boom, make sure everything in there is good. But I want to go back to my point of how a game being linear gives the developers so much control to just do what they do best, which is design an experience for us, design a game for us. And this also really applies to the pacing of a game. I mean, if a developer's making a game and it's linear, they can have control of that, where if it's open-ended, they don't know what the player's going to end up doing. If it's linear, you can be like, okay, level 1 is going to be this amount of difficulty. This part of the stage is going to build up to this part of the stage, and they're going to see this, so then that will get them ready for the boss, or this thing they fight right before the boss, and then stage 1 will get them ready for stage 2, which has these different enemies, which are cool to see after the certain enemies you saw in stage 1. and the theme goes along. Like say in Castlevania, you're going from one part of the castle in stage 1 and then into stage 2, which has this other part of the castle. And the fact that you're seeing those stages in that order contributes to how awesome the game is and the experience that you're going to have. Think about it this way. Let's say there's a big giant open field and you've been given the task of building an obstacle course, and you've got all these different obstacles you can place around. Now, one approach, the open world, open-ended, non-linear approach, would be to just put the obstacles randomly all over the place, all spread apart in no sort of order. People can go through them in whatever order they want. Now, I guess that's kind of cool because then you can choose what order you have. But the more linear approach would be to place all the obstacles in a sequential order so that they build up to each other and almost create a sort of narrative in that way. That's what linear games are doing well. It's not saying non-linear games are inherently bad, but to say that linear games are just inherently bad is just really missing the mark, and honestly I think kind of ignorant. Something else that I also want to mention is there's certain games that give the illusion of being less linear than they actually are. I think games like Super Metroid or Castlevania Symphony of the Night are great examples of this, where sure, you're in an open-ended environment where you can run around and explore different parts of the map, but in order to progress, there are certain things you need in order to get from one area to the next. And so the experience that most players have ends up being more linear than you would think it is on paper, just because people always have to find this item first before they can get to there, and then they go to the next thing and then the next thing, and it has this setup order so that the experience can get crafted in that way while still giving the player a sense of freedom that they can explore this big giant map. I think what it ultimately comes down to is that players want that sense of freedom and choice, and linear games make players feel like they're being told what to do, and they don't want to be told what to do. It's this level comes before that level, and then you go to that level, and players are like, no, I want to choose what I want to do. Here's the thing though. I've always liked linear games because I feel like developers can craft an experience better than I can. I trust a developer to craft an experience more than I trust myself. They're the experts. Let them do the job. Let them determine what level what sequence these levels should come in and craft the experience that way. And so that's why I've always just really loved linear games. I feel like it's the developer taking me for a ride. And before we wrap things up, I also do want to quickly point out some fun examples where it's almost this halfway measure between linear and non-linear. Games like Gunstar Heroes and Thunder Force 4 will actually let you choose the first 4 stages in whichever order you want to play them, and then the later stages get dictated to you by the game itself. So there are some interesting things done that play around with that. But that about does it for my thoughts. Of course, I want to hear what all of you have to say. Do you prefer linear games over non-linear, or do you kind of just look at them as two different choices? You don't necessarily think one is better than the other. I'd be really curious what you all have to say. Of course, we're all retro gamers, and so we're probably going to be prone to liking linear games, but nonetheless, I'd love to hear what all of you have to say. So be sure to leave those comments down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games.